Now, I'm standing here at Fort York National Historic Site. Now, the site itself goes back to 1793. That's when the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, that's to say the Ontario Peninsula, General John Graves Simcoe, established the fort due to its strategic location overlooking the Toronto Harbour and where it could easily defend the entrance to the city of York and the harbour of the city of Toronto. Now, after the Battle of 1812, most of this fort was destroyed, especially when the 300,000 or 30,000 barrels of gunpowder was exploded to hurt the Americans. Now, in 1816, there is a map referred to as the Nicholas map. That's the closest that we can come today to see an actual design of the fort as it would have appeared during the Battle of 1813, April 27th, the Battle of Fort York. In a period of 1820s, the site itself fell into a period of disuse. However, during the Anglophone and Francophone rebellions of 1837, now these were rebellions against the British gentry system of proprietary rights of ownership, which was resented by the French and the English as well, but there was racial overtones as well to that period of civil conflict. So the fort was beefed up a bit. However, in 1841, near the exhibition place, another military fort, a more primary fort, was constructed, and again this fort fell into disuse until the period of 1860s during the American Civil War. During the American Civil War, the British began to question whether or not the Americans would continue to adhere to the policy of demilitarization of the Great Lakes established in the Treaty of 1815, Treaty of Gwent in 1815, when the 49th parallel was drawn between America and Canada. However, after that, again, by 1875, the fort again fell into a period of disuse. And in 1909, this fort was sold to the city of Toronto. And interestingly enough, it was during the 1930s when a sort of FDR-style level of public works began to reinvigorate the site. People were paid as a part of an employment program to reconstruct things like the walls, the ramparts, the blockhouses, and the barracks of the site. So a lot of this fort dates back to the 1930s when it was reconstructed, but the reconstruction was an ongoing process. In the 70s and 80s, Heritage Ontario, partnering with the Royal Ontario Museum, also did a lot of the funding and the rebuilding of this site as we currently see it today. And in 1998, a lot of archaeology began to really take place here, well, in the 80s as well. For example, electrical resistivity was used in around 1998, I believe, to determine the locations of one blockhouse and one barracks along the south wall of the fort. Now, the fort today is open to the public. It's a free admission, so I highly recommend checking this place out. To date, ever since 1998, over 300,000 artifacts have been found here, making this one of the most productive Euro-Canadian archaeological sites, historic sites in Canada today. Highly encourage you guys to come and check this out. Let's go check out the fort itself. Angry Archaeology. The Battle of Fort York, after General Sheaffe told his sub-commander to blow up the 30,000 pounds of gunpowder, about 55 Americans were killed instantly, including the famous General Pike of the American military. Now, interestingly enough, in 2012, some archaeology has been done around here. Now, this is just Play-Doh, but see, since copper is, this is supposed to be copper, these copper rims of the wooden barrels. Now, copper had to be used as the frame for barrels for gunpowder because copper doesn't spark when they hit it together, which is very good if you're transporting gunpowder. Now, ASI Heritage found, and I put the link down below, lots of copper rings that were damaged from a thermal explosion. Now, these copper rings like that in this sort of shape with fire damage that I've just put with a black marker were found here about 200 meters radius from the Grand Armory, which doesn't exist here today, not as a recreation, but at the time 30,000 pounds of gunpowder was stored here. And it was determined that General Pike and his men, 55 died instantly, but over 150 would die later. That's 7/8 of the casualties that the Americans suffered in the battle was just from the explosion alone. One of the reasons why General Sheaffe is criticized heavily for his deception, leaving the flag up, making the Americans think that they were still here. In fact, when General Pike was killed, he was questioning a POW as to how many people were still in the fort. However, General Sheaffe had already left, but he left the bomb for him. And so these were found at a 200-meter radius around Fort York, and they were able to reconstruct, I believe it's ASI Heritage, reconstruct a blast radius, which was the most devastating part of the conflict, of the battle. Now, interestingly, I mentioned that the Americans had the Springfield rifle. Now, the Springfield rifles took about 0.68 diameter ball, whereas the British took just about like a slightly larger, about 75 diameter barrel ball. Interesting about musket balls, since they were made of lead, archaeologists have found these, and over 300,000 artifacts have been found here, making it one of the most productive archaeological historic sites in Toronto. When a lead musket ball hits a target that's soft, it takes the characteristic shape of a teardrop. So that's how archaeologists can actually determine what a lead ball was used for. Where it hit a soft target like a human flesh or clothing, it would take a teardrop shape, as opposed to making a different shape if it were to hit a solid object. Now, modern bullets are made of lead, however, it's a lead alloy. Also, they have a casing of bronze and nickel, so you can't. The riflemen under the command of Benjamin Forsyth, who were the paratroopers, the shock troops of the landing party, about 6 kilometers away from here, they used rifle balls about the size of a nickel, about 50th of an inch or smaller. These were more accurate, and they were harder to use, but they were better for accuracy, and they could go longer distances than the larger British Brown Bessie, the British called it, rifle, or the American Springfield rifles. And so that's one of the aspects of the archaeology here. Another aspect of the archaeology which I found interesting is that now beneath here there's about 6 strata, and in between some of the early strata layers, between 5 and 4, there was a transition layer in the center of the site, and it was determined that the people in the early 19th century were in fact using that site as a midden or a garbage dump. Now, I thought it was very strange why people would use a central location inside a fort as a garbage dump. It turns out that particular location was very waterlogged. The water was running in on there. And so, as an archaeologist, I would interpret that to mean the reason why the early fort inhabitants, why they didn't level the entire place and put gravel, and so the water would drain off, as we would do with modern equipment today, is because they were in a real hurry to get this fort up, I think, in the early 19th century. So that's one interpretation that I would have. They didn't have time to level the ground properly, or they didn't have the manpower. Their objective was primarily to construct walls and buildings and get the batteries up. And you see that there are 4 different batteries here. And at the Battle of 1813, the shore line was a lot closer, so we would have been looking right out onto Lake Ontario here. And so this is why this fort was a advantageous location to protect the city of York at the time and the Toronto Harbor. Now, a lot of the words that we use to describe place names in Canada come from First Nation tribes, and it's interesting that there was a waterlogged area found between, I believe, strata. I have a link below as to the excavations that have been done here. You can see a map of the strata, the different layers of the Fort York site. But the word Toronto comes from Wendat-Huron word meaning poles in the water, referencing to how also fishing, but referencing the how inundated the Toronto area city was at the time. And even the 2 native tribes that took part in the Battle of 1813, the Battle of Fort York, were the Mississauga and the Ojibwe. And the Mississauga word in the Anishinaabe Algonquin language, it comes from a word meaning a river delta or many tributaries. Now, we don't really think of it today because of the modern buildings you see in the background, the skyscrapers and all the concrete and the Gardner here, but the first inhabitants of this place, of course, First Nations people, and then later Euro-Canadian people, they found this place to be very waterlogged. It was actually not that easy to build here. So a lot of the early constructions of 1812 had to be built around the sort of aqua features that were prevalent all throughout the land here. So that's my interpretation of some of the early strata here. The last part I want to mention is that although the fort went into disuse in around 1870, when there was no real purpose for it, since the 1841 is when the fort at the Exhibition Place was built, and the military seemed to have moved there primarily. is that in between layers 4 and 3 of the strata of the Harris matrix map, as what we call it as archaeologists, of the site, we can see that gravel changed progressively from 4 to 3, counting up from gravel to a lot of soil, sand, slit, a lot of organic remains. And so we have pictures confirming this, because the camera was invented in 1835, so we have pictures confirming that by the time the city of Toronto sold this, by the time this place was sold, excuse me, to the city of Toronto in 1909, this place was in fact inundated with water. There were plants everywhere, and we can tell that by looking at the strata, at the layer of organic and soil and slit and clay that had accumulated over the gravel, indicating that the site had thoroughly become disused and neglected by the early 20th century. However, we can see that it's been built up significantly from the 1930s onward. So Kyle, Anchor Archaeology, let's go take a look at the soldier barracks over here and some of the brick houses. Follow me. This is an 1815 stone magazine. This is where, after the Battle of 1813, when the fort was rebuilt, the British rebuilt what was the equivalent of a grand armory, where the 30,000 barrels of gunpowder was stored. This is much smaller in scale, but gives you an idea of the trap that General Sheaffe set for Zubulon Pike at General Zubulon Pike at the end of the Battle of Fort York, which resulted in so many casualties. Let's go take a look. You can see that we mentioned already about the copper frame of the barrels. You can see that the barrels would have been stored here. It's concrete powder, and you can see here, even in these recreations, they've so carefully reconstructed the barrel loops. Now, it was pieces of this that were found by ASI Heritage that allowed them to reconstruct a blast radius that so devastated the American forces in the Battle of 1813 on April 27th. Now, it was around 1 p.m. The battle started at 7 a.m. and by 1 p.m. that's when the explosion, which had about 500 meters blast radius at least, and General Pike was just right in the death zone, where 55 men died immediately and 150 later died of their injuries. It was the most devastating aspect. 7/8 casualties of the Americans just from that explosion alone. Considered a dishonorable piece of deception by General Sheaffe at the time, because he made the Americans think he was still there by leaving the Union Jack to fly in the sky at the fort. And General Pike was in fact interrogating a POW at the time of the explosion. And we can see, you can imagine how many barrels make up 30,000 pounds of gunpowder that would have been stored in a place even far larger than this when the Grand Magazine was in its use. Now, these walls have been made to be bomb-proof as best as they can be. Constructed with brick, and you can see here the copper, non-reactive copper, sort of almost insulation you would call it, but bomb insulation. This fascinating aspect. Again, here at Toronto Fort York, totally free, open air museum. Highly encourage you to check it out. Let's go see what else. Let's go to the soldiers' barracks. Barracks. So if you're a regular soldier, you signed up from your farm, this would be where you slept. Everyone was in bunk beds. The only aspect of privacy, if you were in the bottom bunk, you had a little bit of cloth here to protect yourself. Or not protect, but more just like, privacy. You had the uniforms over here being hung up. You had the only source of fire, the two hearths, two fireplaces on either side. So I can imagine with both of these going at night, it actually got pretty warm. The fire was going. They had their muskets ready right here, just in case they needed them, underneath their pajamas, if interesting enough. And so a soldier's typical daily meal, you can see we have all of the trappings here. So they had a pound of, every day, the soldier would be allowed a pound of flour, or half a pound of bread, a pound of fresh beef, or half a pound of pork. Pork was particularly available in New York. They had an ounce of butter or cheese. Here's the officers' mess, a recreation of some of the decadencies that the officers at Fort York would have been privy to. You know, they had fine porcelain, chinaware, they had a piano, all the trappings of the gentleman, glasses of brandy, lots of space that the regular soldiers just didn't have access to. Let's head downstairs. This is a recreation of an officer's quarters. See the space and the luxuries, even their own little fire chimney. You have their own shelves, you have books, you have the ability to write letters, you have several pairs of clothing, mostly just privacy, their own chamber pot underneath the bed, their own window. This was, in comparison to the regular soldiers, definitely luxurious living compared to their standards. Example of open hearth cooking. Cooking here on the griddle hanging on an S-hook attached to this crane here. These are known as Derby cakes or shortcakes. A recipe actually going back to the 19th century. This sort of cooking would have been characteristic of the period. You have kitchen implements, kitchen instruments would have been cooked over an open hearth like this, something characteristic of what life was like back then. This is actually the oldest kitchen in Toronto, preserved from 1815. These walls here, you can see what's left of the oven here. It's humidity controlled. It's been excavated. It goes along here. We can see the original, the locks. This would have been where the officers' food was made. Interesting. You follow me over here. Now, in 1837, a series of rebellions rocked this territory. Rebellions against the British gentry and their system of proprietary ownership, unfair to the regular colonists, also francophone and anglophone tensions. And so they would create, in 1837, they created this vault. This is an actual vault from 1837, where they would have stored their money, gold, silver, British sterling, pounds, and something just like this. And you can see here there's a little bench where someone would have sat and actually counted their money. Have a look at that, Tony. Okay. '17th. 1813, when 1,700 Americans were disembarking from the 17 ships. You can see that they landed about 6 kilometers away here. This is where the Americans were trying to land. And the Mississauga and the Ojibwe were in the woods here, firing down on them, trying to prevent them from actually disembarking. Now, General Sheaffe dispatched 8th Regiment of Foot to go and support the Ojibwe and the Mississauga in the woods. When they arrived from about 7 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., they were firefighting. And the Americans had on their side the sharpshooter Benjamin Forsyth and his 1st Regiment of Riflemen. Notorious regiment, did not have a good reputation. They were notorious for targeting officers. Officers would fight alongside in the front of the column or in the side giving orders. It was a gentleman agreement, chivalric agreement not to target them. However, Benjamin Forsyth and the riflemen did in fact target them. Now, the General Sheaffe gave orders to act accordingly to the militia commander at the time, Aeneas Shaw, General Aeneas Shaw, and he dispatches 300 militiamen. Ostensibly, they were to support the men fighting in the woods, but however, he took along Dundas Street and he went basically just to his house to hang out. The militiamen were notoriously unreliable. These were provincial men who didn't have a lot of stake in their perspective to continue the fight and didn't care whether they were American or British, potentially. But they ostensibly, they came out of the fort here, and they went along this street here, Queen Street, and in order to prevent the Americans from flanking. However, they had already really disembarked the Americans here, so by 1 p.m., General Zubedon Pike was in command, and he was just outside of the fort here, when General Sheaffe gave the clandestine order to keep the flag. The Union Jack here was still flying, making General Zubedon Pike believe that the men were still in there. And as he was questioning POW as to how many men were in there, 30,000 pounds of gunpowder exploded from the Grand Armory, killing General Pike and 55 other American soldiers immediately. Over 150 others dying later of the wounds. About 7/8 of the American casualties that day came. About 5/8 of the American casualties that day, just from this explosion alone. General Sheaffe had ordered the he was the lieutenant governor of Upper Canada at the time. He gave the order to rig the explosions and to deceive General Pike, and he surrendered the fort, but he burned the bridge over the Don River on his escape, and the Americans would later spend the next 2 days rampaging their way through the town of York, getting revenge for their killed field general. The other general, General Henry Dearborn, made on the American side, made the brave decision to stay on the boats instead of disembarking with his men. So it was General Zumwalt Pike was the one who was respected by his men. So his death in this unchivalric way of deception was not looked kindly upon in history. And the British hated General Sheaffe for surrendering the fort. General Sheaffe was removed from his command. He was a Boston-born British Army officer, and he was recalled to England after this battle, and he was prevented from ever being commissioned a command ever again. Battle of 1813. Before we begin to explore Fort York, I just want to give you some background to the Battle of Fort York and some context for the War of 1812. Now, the War of 1812, which lasted from 1812 on and off to 1815, was largely a war over control of the Great Lakes. And it was between the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and the 40-year-old United States of America. The majority of the conflict took place here in the Ontario Peninsula, referred to by the British as Upper Canada, Lower Canada being French Canada, a reference to the current of the St. Lawrence, a crucial waterway, which was a major strategic value during the War of 1812. And unlike the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the War of 1812 can be characterized by relatively small battles in comparison to the existential battles that were going on between England and France at the time. You see, Great Britain could not commit the majority of its resources. Its ships and its army had to stay fighting Napoleon in Europe. And the 40-year-old United States of America didn't really have the infrastructure to create massive fleets to challenge Great Britain or to field thousands and thousands of soldiers. In fact, President James Madison had to recruit thousands and thousands of newly trained American militiamen in order to begin to challenge Great Britain. But Great Britain suffered from a ship and a manpower deficit during the War of 1812. And one of the other aspects of the War of 1812, which would be said to be characteristic of it, would be the involvement of First Nations people fighting on behalf of Great Britain, fighting for the hope of an independent state, which was promised to the great leader Tecumseh, who had united the Anishinaabe-speaking people, the people native to the Great Lakes region. The word Ontario, in fact, means Great Lakes. And one of the aspects of the war, which I believe is Jeremy's War, 1812, by John Ibison, a piece of historical fiction, but only a fictitious protagonist, but it deals very well with the betrayal of the First Nations people by the British, that the England didn't have any intention of actually giving or allowing the First Nations people to establish an independent state where they could live and be free of the frontier violence, which was so devastating to First Nations people, especially since the Americans at this time were becoming increasingly aggressive, and the concepts like manifest destiny and all these very, very racially motivated frontier violence that became just epidemic in what was then the United States at the time. So if there was one shameful aspect of the war for Great Britain, it would indeed be the betrayal of First Nations people, because you'll see in this book, without Tecumseh, without the Ojibwe, the Mississauga, the Potawatomi, and other tribes were fighting on behalf of Great Britain surely would have lost the War of 1812, and control of the Ontario Peninsula and what we call Ontario today would definitely be in control of the United States of America. So Canada would not be what it is today without the help of the First Nations people, something that this book does justice to, I feel. Now, one of the causes of the war, the War of 1812, like a lot of wars, is the causes of which are still debated a lot today. Now, it was the United States of America who declared war in 1812, and if we are to believe the then President
James Madison's June 1st, 1812 war letter to Congress, we would be led to believe that it was in fact over maritime shipping rights. You see, Great Britain had a trade embargo on Europe to stop Napoleon from gaining access to resources, and you would think Napoleon would find a willing ally in America, and America would have found a willing ally in the person of Napoleon. However, Napoleon never really 100% warmed up to the 40-year-old United States of America. And both French and English vessels harassed the maritime vessels of the United States of America. But Napoleon did eventually come to a sort of non-aggression pact with America. And even President James Madison, in his war message, admits that although the French are attacking us on the sea, the English are doing that to a greater extent, so we should declare war on them. And I found that was strange, but if you think about the person of Napoleon, someone who styles himself as an emperor and a newly formed republic that is definitionally against all forms of nobility, we could see maybe one of the reasons why Napoleon and the United States of America never really got 100% along together, even though they had agreements like the Louisiana land purchase and other things like that. And if you look at who voted for war in America, it is strange because the states at the time that voted in favor of war, like the southern states like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Louisiana, and in the West at the time, the western frontier of America was Ohio, Kansas, and Tennessee, they all voted in favor of war. These were predominantly slave states. Practicing the crime of slavery was the primary economic aspect of these states at the time. But the states that were most closely related to maritime trade, like New York, New Jersey, and New England, they all voted no against war. And so we can see that at the time the far western territories like California was in control of New Spain, and territories like Missouri and even Michigan, they had no voting rights because they were considered territories at the time. The United States was a lot smaller. It was really just the eastern seaboard at the time. And the America division is also revealed in the person of Alexander Conti Hansen, who was an anti-war member of the Federalist Party, that's against the party of President James Madison. He had a newspaper which was anti-war, which was burned down twice by angry mobs during the War of 1812. So it's showing that there was United States was very divided on the war, with Federalists going after the Democratic Republican Party, pro-anti-war. It seems that the slave states wanted war. Now, the brutality of the slave states makes a lot of people rightly think that since these people were, they practiced a brutal crime against humanity like slavery, they saw an opportunity to take land from the British Empire when England was weak because it couldn't commit its forces to North America while dealing with Europe. And there probably is some truth to that. Because you have American politicians at the time, like a slave apologist, I'll call him, Henry Clay, who was instrumental in creating the Missouri Compromise, which prolonged slavery practice in the United States of America. And John C. Calhoun, who looked just as crazy as he was, who was an ardent defender of the crime of slavery at the time. These men were war hawks. They had a great influence over President James Madison. And it is possible that the slavers, or I'll call them the parasitic Americans, who stole the labor of other people. And by the way, if you want to look up the people who actually did embody the American values at the time, like resourcefulness and self-determination and never giving up, please read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass or 13 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. These were the true American heroes of the time. And another aspect that may have caused the War of 1812 was in fact the fur trade. And this was postulated in 1911 by Howard T. Lewis. You can see how long this war has been debated. The fur trade in the United States of America, Fort Mackinac here being instrumental to the control of the fur trade, and St. Joseph Island for the English on this side, The fur trade was a huge business in North America at the time. For example, in December 1811 statistic we have available that the British fur trade was worth $1.3 million, or at the time, this is American dollars, versus the United States of America, whose fur trade only brought in about 200,000 US dollars. So like 1.3 million in compare, adjusted for inflation today is about $30 million. So we can see that the British had a dominating control of the fur trade. So whether it was maritime rights, or it was the agriculturally productive Ontario Peninsula, or was it control of the fur trade, stealing the fur trade away from the British, probably a combination of all these factors played into the causes of the War of 1812. Now, let's take a look at some of the battles of the War of 1812. On June 29th, 1812, the British were the first to strike, at least on the sea, when two American schooners were taken in the St. Lawrence. The schooners were the Sophia and the Island Packet, showing the importance early on of the St. Lawrence River connecting the British, English, and First Nation forces to the Atlantic power for logistical supplies. However, it was the United States that invaded first over land. It was General Hull here at Fort Detroit who was able to take the fort called Sandwich, modern-day city of Windsor, here in Ontario, Canada today. However, this would be the moment of fleeting glory for the ill-fated General Hull, as we'll soon see, because tide turned against General Hull very quickly when the British at St. Joseph Island were able to capture Fort Mackinac, crucial for the American control of their half of the fur trade at the time. Now, this capture of Fort Mackinac is important for several reasons. One, the British were able to surprise General Roberts with 600 men and a cannon, also with First Nation allies, were able to take Fort Mackinac that was only manned by 60 United States militiamen, because they didn't actually, Fort Mackinac wasn't aware that war had broken out. This is June 29th, and James Madison's war message was in June 1st, so this is the 1800s when messages had to travel slowly, even person to person, and the fog of war is a very real reality. They didn't have the internet or phones or not even radio signals to communicate. St. Joseph Island, the capture of Fort Mackinac by General Roberts was successful because now the Fort Mackinac was in control of a Lieutenant Porter Hanks. And Lieutenant Porter Hanks, whether it was personal intuition or he heard something from locals in the area, he sent out a fur tradesman and a commissioned officer in the American militia at the time by the name of Michael Duzman to investigate an area close by Fort Mackinac, which has since been named British Landing after the invasion itself. Now, Michael Duzman was to report back of any British activities, but he betrayed America immediately after being captured by General Roberts and his forces, and told General Roberts that the Fort Mackinac only had 60 men ready to resist him. So General Roberts positioned his cannon near the woods out from British Landing, fired a shot from the artillery, and then forced the fort to surrender. Now, Lieutenant Porter Hanks' surrender would cause him to be court-martialed later, and we'll find out why that becomes ironic with regards to his relationship with the ill-fated General Hull later. But an important part of the leadership quality for the British in the form of General Isaac Brock, who at this time was the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, was that Lieutenant Brock, unlike his American foes at the time, kept his fort commanders in communication. He sent them regular letters and dispatches. He kept them up on what was happening and where. There was a greater degree of integrated communication among the British forces, at least early on in the War of 1812, at least in the case of when St. Joseph Island and General Roberts took Fort Mackinac, definitely. Now, Fort Mackinac was a major turning point because General Hull at Sandwich, after learning that the First Nation Confederacy under the leadership of the great Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief, were beginning to gather at Amherstburg, General Hall at Sandwich retreated back to Detroit because of the forces that were assembling at Amherstburg and due to the capture of Fort Mackinac by the British. And this was a turning point because in July 19th, 1812, the British fleet in Lower Ontario, known as Sachets Harbour, they began an attempt to attack Sachets Harbour. And although this may have been sort of a fleeting moment of a confidence, maybe overconfidence on the part of the British sent their Kingston fleet, which was the center base of their power in Upper Canada at this time, and to attack Sachets Harbour, which was a major force for shipbuilding and also for stationing troops on the American side. It was really each other's citadel of power, if you will. The British sent the great brig with 23 guns, another ship, the Prince Regent, the Earl of Moray, 20 guns, 22 guns, what we call cannons. Also the Governor Simcoe and the Seneca with 2 guns. The habit of North American people naming military equipment after First Nations tribe is something that we can see started very early on. Now, although when the Royal George, the great brig Royal George, was damaged while attempting to fire a broadside at Sachets Harbour, I should mention that the United States only had 1 brig, an Oneida. About 3,000 militiamen were stationed here at the time of the attack at Sachets Bay, and 1 shore battery, or like anti-ship artillery. When the Royal George in Sachets Harbour took damage while attempting to fire a broadside, the British quickly retreated back to Kingston Harbour. Now, this shows that the British had a considerable unwillingness to really risk their fleet, and the reason why that abortive attempt to take the American linchpin in their defenses for Lake Ontario, why that even was undertaken is something which is still a bit of a mystery, but the reason that the British had naval superiority at that time is that the American Navy was located elsewhere. So the forces for the United States, they were able to later on reposition their naval forces at Sachets Bay to prevent Kingston Harbour fleet from doing anything else in the future, because the United States had ships elsewhere. Now, one battle that occurred in 1812 on August 5th, the Battle of Brownstown, happened during the early period. Most of the land battles happened here, but near Fort Detroit and Fort Sandwich, near Lake Sinclair and modern-day Michigan and far south Ontario Peninsula. Now, we mentioned that the involvement of Native peoples is one of the characteristics of the War of 1812, and at the Battle of Brownstown in 1812, this battle shows the prowess of Tecumseh and other Native war chiefs of the time. It shows also the psychological effect that the Natives were having on the Americans. Now, the Americans considered British people fighting alongside the Natives. They actually published cartoons, what we would call them like pamphlets and leaflets, decrying and defaming the British, in fact calling them race traitors at the time for fighting alongside Native people. But the Americans, who were committing egregious frontier violence against Native people, they were quite afraid of the Native people in battle. And because the Battle of Brownstown, which occurred in between Fort Detroit and Fort Meages here, it was near a series of Wendayut villages, who were an Iroquois-speaking people, and under the leadership of Tecumseh, a mere 25 First Nations warriors were able to rout a regiment of 200 American militiamen, and this was a surprise. Because the just in sheer numbers, but another characteristic of the War of 1812 is that the militiamen were notorious and unreliable. These were not professional soldiers. These were recent recruits. These are people who didn't really have much of a stake, they felt, in this war in the first place, because America was only 40 years old, and And although a lot of people who refused to become American citizens ended up settling in the Ontario Peninsula, feelings of nationalism in the continent were very vague. They weren't very well solidified in people's minds. This idea of American and Canadian, it was more of a porous relationship. People really weren't willing to die to be one or the other. And on the part of Tecumseh fighting with the British, we could see that this was really, for them, a deal with one devil against another, because it was only half a generation earlier, in 1763, during what's referred to as Pontiac's War, but British historians used to call the Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac being a native war chief of the time, whose name has been reappropriated for a car. But Pontiac was able to unite 9 tribes against Britain in 1763. That's the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, Mingo, Seneca, Wendayut, the Kinikibo, the Illinois, and Miami. All of these tribes united to fight against Britain. And although the Pontiac's Rebellion militarily did not succeed, we can see that the Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George, which effectively established everything west of the Appalachian Mountains in 1763 to be a native reserve, we could see that that was one of the major reasons why, after 1811, when future American President William Henry Harrison destroyed Tecumseh and his brother Texquanoa's city of Prophetstown, modern-day Lafayette, Illinois, we could see why Tecumseh chose to fight with the British, because the Royal Proclamation of 1763 laid the foundation for the possibility of a creation of an independent First Nation state. And although that wouldn't come to be, because another one of the themes of War of 1812 is the betrayal of the First Nations people, despite their indispensable importance to the British military at this time. We should also mention that it was, in fact, during the Pontiac's Rebellion where the British soldiers deliberately gave blankets infected with smallpox to First Nations people. One of the examples of the horrific frontier violence going on at the time. Now, Tecumseh and another chief, Blue Jacket, and Tenskwatawa. Now, if you want to hear more about who these people were, I think recovering voices of the First Nation leaders is very important, to make sure that we consider, that we acknowledge that these people are active stakeholders in our ongoing history. Now, Tecumseh was a great orator, along with other chiefs like Blue Jacket of other native tribes, and speeches to their own people and the British at the time from the War of 1812 are recorded and out free. If you check the link below, called the Napoleon Series, the War of 1812 magazines, they have all the issues of the magazines from 2006 to 2018 for free for you to pursue. I mean, Tecumseh's speeches are there, eyewitness accounts of battles, like the battles of Queenston Heights, that we'll talk about in a moment. So I definitely recommend looking that over. But back to the battles. In 1812, August 16, this was the surrender of Fort Detroit, General Hall's great disgrace. Now, General Hall has been held up here since he retreated from Sandwich, now modern-day Windsor, Ontario. Now, how the British, despite numbering only 600 First Nation warriors, including Tecumseh himself, 5 field guns and 2 ships, were able to take on a Fort Detroit with over 3,000 American militiamen, fully stocked, fully armed, is detailed in the Jeremy's War, historical fiction, but the brief synopsis is that General Brock was in command of the British forces. General Brock and Tecumseh, this is their famous co-commanding, we could say, battle operation, the capture of Fort Detroit. Now, General Brock initially intended to siege the fort, traditionally, but he was able to learn that a convoy coming to resupply the fort was nearby in the woods, and he repositioned his forces by the woods, and through an art of miraculous, incredible deception, war deception, a strategic war deception, Tecumseh and General Brock were able to convince General Hall in Fort Detroit that there were thousands and thousands and thousands of native warriors, which really just put fear to the heart of the Americans there, especially General Hall, who surrendered his 2,500 men. Ironically, it's Lieutenant Porter Hanks, Fort Mackinac. he was one of only 7 Americans actually killed at that battle when one of the artillery fires from General Brock's artillery killed him, and he was awaiting court-martial for his surrender of Fort Mackinac. However, General Hull ended up surrendering Fort Detroit, and it was General Hull who was later court-martialed for this surrender and sentenced to death by the American government. General Hull's sentence of death was only commuted out of by James Madison out of respect for General Hull's service during the American Revolutionary War. And this was the end of General Hull. And this effect, one effect of this battle was that the First Nation warriors began to eagerly join the British against America. America was thoroughly demoralized in the conflict. Now, this is when things started to look really bad for America. So it was Tecumseh and General Brock are remembered, even though they only cooperated with each other for a few days. Their partnership is sort of romanticized. In 1812, October 13th, at the Battle of Queenston Heights, near the Niagara River here, unfortunately General Brock would be killed, leading a charge to recover an artillery battery that was captured by the Americans. Now, it was General Sheaffe who ended up bringing his forces to take on the Americans at Fort Niagara, at Queenston Heights. And General Sheaffe, after General Brock was killed, took over the lieutenant governorship of Upper Canada. Now, on February 22nd, 1813, this is the Battle of Ausenberg. Ausenberg being a town opposite of Prescott on the St. Lawrence. Now, the lieutenant governor of Lower Canada, George Prevost, was coming down to inspect Upper Canada at the time. And when the forces from Lower Canada were temporarily brought forward to Prescott, the British decided to take advantage of their temporary numerical superiority and just overran Augsburg, forever at that point establishing the British control of the St. Lawrence, a crucial waterway connecting them with their Atlantic power base. And that was crucial. Even at the Battle of Augsburg, the famous American rifleman Benjamin Forsyth would be disgraced. He was forced to retreat. And feeling these defeats, the American leadership, so General Harry Dearborn, General Zebulon Pike, Secretary of War Armstrong Jr., and James Madison, they devised a new plan. They realized that they had to start winning some battles. So they began to gather all forces at Sachet's Harbor. And their idea was to first attack Kingston, but then at the Battle of Augsburg, they realized that the British could reinforce their position at Kingston too easily and too quickly from Lower Canada. So they decided they needed some psychological victories. They needed to destroy the will of the Ontario provincial militiamen from fighting, which was the basis of their ground forces, and try to convince their native warriors to defect and stop supporting them by getting some victories on the board. So Henry Dearborn and Zebulon Pike and Commodore Isaac Chauncey, they decided to attack the vulnerable Fort York, future site of the city of Toronto. So this was the change strategy. This was the strategy behind the invasion of Fort York. The Americans were desperate for a victory. Fort York, there was only 600 men ready to resist. They had no ships. All the British were at Kingston Harbor, and all the forces were busy and near Fort George and the Fort Niagara frontier, or they were busy at Fort Detroit. So this was the overall context of the battle in the year just prior, in the months prior, April 27th, 1813. Now let's check a look at Fort York.
Here at the historic Fort York, we can see down the main thoroughfare. We have the barracks where the soldiers would have slept. We have what's known as a blockhouse. This was a military defensible structure where soldiers can put their guns out of the window. And although speaking of historical fiction, I recommend Jeremy's War by John Ibbenson. Now, this book deals with the realities of the War of 1812 as experienced by its protagonist, Jeremy. Now, one of the themes of the book would be betrayal, and that's relevant to the War of 1812 when the protagonist actually becomes disillusioned with a somewhat fictitious General Brock, who is responsible for capturing the fort of Detroit from the Americans in the War of 1812. working with the native leader Tecumseh. Now, a little bit about Tecumseh, why I think this book does justice to the native involvement in the War of 1812 is because at the time of the War of 1812, the natives under the command of the Shawnee chief Tecumseh united against the Americans with the British. Now, this is very strange because at the time the British were offering conciliatory promises to Tecumseh and to the Confederation of First Nations, largely an Anishinaabe union or a union of Anishinaabe Algonquin-speaking peoples from around the Great Lakes. The British were making overtures of promises like promising them an own independent state, an independent country. Now, none of those promises came to fruition, unfortunately, because after the War of American Independence, America became extremely violent towards First Nation people, including Anishinaabe-speaking people in the state of Michigan or the Michigan territories, Michilimackinac, the native word referencing that. The native involvement in the War of 1812 was extremely advantageous for the British. In fact, the book makes it clear that without the assistance of Ojibwe warriors, the British would have failed to capture the city of Detroit. And in fact, the British were suffering from a manpower shortage because the War of 1812 occurred during the same time as the Napoleonic Wars, and the majority of England's fleet and regular soldiers were tied up in Europe fighting Napoleon. Now, that is interesting because the British decided to keep the majority of their forces at Quebec City and Kingston Harbor at the time in order to control the St. Lawrence. However, Lower Canada, the Ontario Peninsula, or Upper Canada, the Lower Peninsula, was neglected. And so a lot of these forts were severely undermanned. And the battle that occurred here in 1813, it was only 600 men, and only 300 of them really had any battle experience. Soldiers, so like 600 total, but only 300 had any real fighting experience under the command of General Schaeff, And so the native involvement in the war can't be understated. And so the betrayal of the natives by the British is something that is another horrible instance in history in terms of the relations between First Nations and people of European descent. Now, the Tecumseh and his confederation of First Nation people, just give you an idea of who they were. Now, this is based on an 1814 treaty concession map by the Americans. In the Michigan Territory, there was to the north the Ottawa, there was the Potawatomi, there was also the Ojibwe. These three tribes were Anishinaabe or Algonquin-speaking people, and they formed a Council of Three Fires. This is an alliance going back to the 8th century Common Era. And now, Tecumseh himself was a Shawnee person from further south in Indiana. However, there was also a non-Anishinaabe, a non-Algonquin-speaking people called the Ho-Chunk or the Winnebago, whose name had been reappropriated for an RV, living into the southeast of the Michigan Territory in Illinois at the time. And Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa, his brother really created a new anti-American revolutionary movement that is a revitalizing movement for First Nations people, and their center of control and their center of operation was at Prophetstown in modern-day Lafayette, Illinois. It was from here that Tecumseh came the closest to any other First Nations leader of the 19th century to uniting all Native people, all First Nations people in North America at the time against the Americans, who were becoming extremely violent. Frontier violence was becoming, it is taking on just extremely cruel and inhumane practices. And so it's one of the ironies of history that the Americans, having just won their independence in the American Revolution, one of the first things that they did collectively was to deny that same right of independence to the First Nations people here in North America.